And hello, everyone, and welcome to, I think it's the 5th or 6th OASPA Open Scholarship webinar. And we've got another fantastic lineup today. But first, I would just like to tell you a little bit for those who haven't been here before, and welcome to everyone who has, and to the newcomers. We've got about more than 150 people registered. We've got almost half of that already in participating, and they're increasing all the time. We have people from associations, universities, publishers associations from Canada, Germany, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Uganda, Japan, Kenya. So it is just fantastic that we're able to provide these public webinars, and that is very much down to OASPA, and Claire Redhead is my co-chair here, and she's the executive director, and to Alison Anderson from Copyright Clearance, who's providing all the tech for us for free. And all the slides and the recording will be freely available for you to access afterwards. So we have very little time, as usual, so we're going to just crack on. It's going to be for about an hour. Please keep your questions, well, you can certainly type your questions anytime you like, but what we're going to do is have the panel discussion at the end, and then we'll select all the questions. So you may want to store up some or before hearing, or you may want to particularly focus on one person to answer your questions, and we'll try and field them as best as possible. We have our lineup. We have 3 global experts in data sharing policies for publishers here today. And I think the thing that brings them all together is that they are all involved in global projects to align different stakeholders around common policies for practice and policies around data sharing. And we're really lucky to have Iain Hrynaszkiewicz from Springer Nature, who will be talking about the work he's doing in particular with RDA, and Tina Lee, the PR and project coordinator from Belmont Forum. And that's a Belmont Forum of 28 funders who have got together to come and agree a funder policy and a publisher policy around data access statements. And then finally, but certainly by no means least, we've got Shelley Stall, who's director for the American Geophysical Union data programs, and she's had the remarkable job of herding an entire discipline across the entire world to get behind a fair data policy. I mean, it's sort of herding cats, but many, many different species of cats. And so without any more ado, let's progress. So Iain, please go for it. I think you'll have to unmute yourself, Iain.
Yeah, okay, I'm unmuted. I will just make sure I can progress the slides, and I can. So that appears to be working. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for listening, and hello, Internet. So I'm going to be speaking briefly about research data policies of publishers in general, and in particular about a project which I'm working on with others in an organization called the Research Data Alliance, which is trying to come up with a common approach for research data policy, which could, in principle, be adopted by all journals and publishers. So my presentation is Research Data Policy Succession for Success, and that's a casual reference to the way in which I feel one needs to approach data policy in order for it to be as widely applicable and adoptable by as many journals, disciplines and stakeholders as possible. So, a bit of background. Historically and possibly presently as well, journals' research data policies can be confusing. This figure and this statement is evidenced by a piece of work that was carried out by an organization called JISC in the UK about 4 years ago. They attempted to create a database of all journals' research data policies. But what they found is that the landscape or the ecosystem of journal research data policies is not harmonious, often lacking clarity as to whether journals have a policy, and if so, how strong that policy is. and also lots of differences between disciplines. And what they concluded was that they were unable to create a comprehensive catalogue of data policies because it simply wasn't possible with the ecosystem as it was at the time in 2015. However, we do know that journal policies can be a force for good. They can create behavioral change. There are numerous studies, some of them looking at actual researcher behavior, actual impacts of policies, and some which are surveys of what researchers think and what they say. And there is good evidence that journals that have a strong policy that is backed up with action do lead to increases in data sharing. Also, researchers report that amongst other factors, publisher and journal policy is something that would motivate them to share data, so they can create change. However, for the publishers in the room in particular, and those who operate journals, when we introduce changes to our processes, to our editorial checks, particularly when you have to do more to process a manuscript, that has a cost associated with it. That can be time, but that can also be a real budgetary cost as well. The figures that I'm showing on this slide are from a small study that we conducted at the Nature journals a couple of years ago. We introduced a new type of policy that required every paper published in the Nature journals to include a data availability statement. We'll hear a bit more about those in details later in the session. But this involved the editors asking the authors to give a new section to their papers that described where their data were. And we measured the amount of time that took, how much extra time it took to process manuscripts. And on average, across 4 journals, we found it was increasing processing time by about 10 minutes. So not a huge amount of time, but when you're operating at a large scale, that can soon add up. And also the figure on the right-hand side of my slide has found that when we looked at the kinds of statements people are providing, which sometimes simply say, my data are available on request, but sometimes they say, my data's in a repository and here's a link to it. So that is the third type of statement in that figure. The statements that actually provide the data were taking the longest to look at when compared to the statement that simply said available on request. The fourth type of statement in my graph isn't quite so relevant here. It's very specific to something at the Nature journals. So I'll pass over that anomaly. The point I'm making is there are costs associated with enforcing data sharing, which we need to understand if we are to implement these changes more widely. Of course, as costs, there are benefits. Benefits to researchers, benefits to journals, benefits to the publisher, benefits to the wider society. So there is a good amount of evidence that sharing and managing research data can increase the visibility and potential for reuse of research. The right-hand side of my slide is a summary of 4 different studies which found an association between sharing research data associated with a paper and an increase in citations to those papers by an average of around 25%. So there's a benefit in terms of citations for the researcher, for the journal. Also, on the left-hand side, referencing a study that found that 4 studies funded by the NSF and the NIH in the US, those that archived their data produced more papers. So more productive projects in terms of the number of papers and potentially more citations to those papers that are created through properly managing and linking to research data. So understanding the benefits and also understanding the costs is really important. And of course, at publishers, there have been, in the last 3 years in particular, a lot of developments on research data policy. At Springer Nature, where I work, just over 3 years ago, we introduced an initiative to standardize and harmonize the research data policies of our journals. We publish around 2,500 journals. And central to our approach to trying to introduce a data policy to all of these journals in many different disciplines was that we couldn't introduce the same type of policy, the same strength of policy to every journal. We have life sciences, we have social sciences, we have humanities. Different communities have very different needs, different levels of awareness with data sharing. So central to the approach to this large project, which is still ongoing, was to have similar, distinct but options for data policy that begin with a basic policy, the type 1 policy, which simply encourages data sharing, and then moving up to a second, the third and the fourth type of policy, which have growing numbers of requirements and therefore growing levels of resources needed to implement them consistently. But there are common threads that run through all of these policies, things like promoting data citation, things like promoting deposition in repositories, and also promoting consistent approaches like data availability statements to communicating where data are associated with publications. And what we've seen is, pleasingly, lots of other large publishers have introduced similar approaches to standardizing and promoting research data policies. So Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor & Francis, BMJ, and others also now have more standard and more visible and more prevalent approaches to research data policy, which is a good thing. But there could also be challenges associated with that. We might arguably be creating this situation. This is a cartoon many of us may have seen a number of times before. So arguably we have several organizations creating similar approaches to the same kind of problem. So we now arguably have several different standards. So how do we solve that problem? We just create a standard that overrules all of those standards is one possibility. That's not quite what we're doing. What I think is a good solution to this problem is if we could actually define a common framework that doesn't necessarily require organizations to change their approach or move to a different standard, but just enables all publishers to at least determine where they sit on a framework, on a scale that is consistent and workable for all organizations. So we needed a vehicle to carry out that kind of activity, and fortunately one such vehicle, one such organization exists in the form of the Research Data RDA, a global organization, brings together interested parties on all kinds of topics in research data. So just under 3 years ago, we, the people on this slide here, we created an interest group focused on data policy, standardization, and implementation. And so this was designed to build on and bring together the work of some publishers, but also other stakeholders as well, from JISC, which is a scholarly service provider and infrastructure provider in the UK, and Natasha Simons, who works at the Australian Research Data Commons. So we have quite a broad remit with this group. It's not just journal research data policy. We actually eventually want to help define common frameworks for research data policy for lots of stakeholders, so funding agencies, institutions, societies potentially. And what we want to do is identify where there is the most need to create these common approaches to data policy and produce guidance and produce tools to enable those stakeholders to adopt and implement those policies consistently, and also to connect interested parties in research data policy. So we have a very broad remit, but we determined quite early on that journal research data policy is a priority area. It's obviously an area, as you have now seen, where there has been a lot of activity, but there is also a lot of communication with researchers happening at journals. So this is another reason why journal policy is a logical place to start with this interest group. So my last few slides are really to summarize what we've been doing in this global activity in the last couple of years, and it's also presenting our first output, which is a set of guidelines. It's a research data policy framework for all journals and publishers, which, as I've mentioned, our aim is to enable it to be compatible with and adoptable by any journal or publisher, regardless of whether they've already started the process of introducing a data sharing policy. So this paper was actually released as a preprint earlier this week. It's in Figshare, so you are free to read it in its full 12,000 word detail. So a bit of a health warning. It's a bit of a boring paper unless you're a publisher or a journal or someone very interested in data policy. And I say that because there's a lot of detail, but it's the kind of detail one needs if you really are going to be the person looking at implementation and evaluating how that might work at your organization. So how did we go about it? We firstly looked at the work that was already done, which is good practice for any piece of research. So we looked, of course, at Springer Nature, which I know very well, but also Elsevier, Wiley, but also publishers like PLOS, who had very well-established data policies and quite strong data policies. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel where it wasn't necessary. We also looked at guidelines from other stakeholders as well. So there's an organization called the Center for Open Science. They have a very comprehensive set of guidelines called Transparency and Openness Promotion, or TOP guidelines. So they don't just cover data, but they also cover other aspects of open science. So very aspirational, very comprehensive. We considered those also. And also another set of guidelines was produced by an organization called Code Data, which focused more on good practice for data policy, not for journals, but for funders and for institutions as well, which was also quite revealing in terms of identifying there are common needs and requirements for all those stakeholders and what a sensible data policy might look like. So that was the desk research, and we also held community activities, community calls in 2017, 2 different time zones to gather everyone's requirements on data policy. So rather than tell people what we think should be in the data policy, we had various stakeholders, librarians, publishers, researchers tell us. We made a public draft available of the document in February 2018, and we received more than 30 comments from more than 20 reviewers. So anyone who's dealt with reviewer 3, try dealing with reviewer 20. But no, it was a very valuable process on the draft, and then that enabled us to create a second version, final version, which we actually presented at the most recent RDA in April, just before making the final draft available this week. So what we want to solve with this global framework is we want to solve those problems around policy harmonization and reducing potential confusion, the things I alluded to earlier, but also with this document, and sort of based on our experience of introducing policies over the last couple of years, is that we can still really improve the clarity of policies. So being very clear with editors and with authors what you actually have to do if you're submitting to a journal that has this policy, and also being very clear if you don't have to do anything. Because what we find is that authors and editors, when they're asked questions of the publisher about policy, they really just want to know, do I have to share my data or not? And sometimes the policy wording is not so clear on that front. Also, we wanted it to be very practical and very pragmatic and very transparent. So, for example, we know that introducing data sharing policies can be hard, it can be resource intensive, and that's okay. But we wanted to provide a number of options whereby journals could make progress in small steps without necessarily letting the best possible policy be the enemy of making any process at all. So, for example, we have a type of policy that enables journals to simply require statements from authors about data availability, but they make no guarantees of checking those statements. So it's enabling people to make smaller steps towards a stronger policy. We also that also enforces the statement here that aspirational policies are good to aspire to, but if everything is aspirational, it's not implementable. So we wanted to have various steps to reflect the nuances of what it's like to run journals in the real world. So the key figure, I guess the tweetable output from our paper is this this table here. So what we've come up with is a set of 14 standard features for a research data policy. I won't read through them all, you can see them there, but they cover things like what data the policy applies to, what the position on data repositories is, data citation, also whether data sharing is mandatory or not. But then also to explain the key, the dark and the light spots indicate when someone has to do something. So that something might be the author must deposit, or it might be the journal must check something has happened. But again, with that aim that we just want to make it very clear when there is something that needs to happen that might have a cost or a process associated with it, which is very important for journals to know if they're to implement things consistently. Also included in the paper are template policy texts. So at the end of the paper, for the 6 different types of policies, there are standard pieces of text, each aligned with the different features. And then also to explain the top left of my slide, there is a summary of what it means. So what you have to do and what you don't have to do. So you have to share data sometimes with this Type 4 policy, but it's optional, for example, if you want to cite your data. So final slide, this is just been released into the wild, and we're doing work now to identify and work with early adopters. A journal I know particularly well, Scientific Data, will be adopting this common framework. But also we have a lot of work to do in terms of publisher outreach and engagement, and this activity is very good to do that, also working with other bodies like STM as well. We also want to make it easy for journals to assess their policy needs, perhaps with a simple web tool, and also to continue to collaborate with other interested parties on that important question of the costs and the benefits. Thank you.
Thanks. That's great, Ian. We're going to go to Tina next. I just wanted to say that what we're not talking about here is the value of data sharing at one level. It's more about the implementation. And interestingly, it is one of the things that publishers of all persuasions and business models tend to agree on. It's something that researchers tend to, and different disciplines tend to not agree on so much. And one of the aims is to try and reduce the burden on researchers by aligning policies to make it as easy as policies as possible. Tina, please go ahead.
Right. Thank you, Katrina, and thank you, Claire and OASP for inviting Belmont Forum e-infrastructures and data management team to participate in this webinar. My focus this morning will be on the data accessibility statement that we developed as a value-added element to the Belmont's goal of funding transdisciplinary global environmental change research. And real quickly, I developed this presentation along with Rowena Davis, my project coordinator at the project. So we'll continue. Oops, not having trouble able to. There we go. I'm sorry. Briefly, Belmont Forum is, as Katrina mentioned, an international partnership. We are currently at 28 national science funding agencies, science councils, and a few NGOs that participate together to kind of break the mold of multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research. Some of our partners actually in the e-infrastructures project are listed on here: ANR in France, JST Japan, MOST in Taiwan, and NERC in the UK. So NSF did not, I'm funded by NSF, but they worked together to basically have us do an open data policy that the Belmont Forum had adopted in 2015. As I mentioned, the policy was adopted in 2015, and along with the FAIR data, they are very much aligned in terms of outlining for the researchers and for the funding agencies what open data meant to them at the time. It still is evolving slightly as details about how to implement this come out, but basically data should be discoverable, accessible, understandable, and manageable, and those align very well with the FAIR principles, which Shelley will, I'm sure, talk in a lot more detail. The goal there, and to me the interesting part, was how forward-thinking and how timely. As Ian said, the RDA group that was focusing on publishing data accessibility statements started about the same time. So we were lucky to ride that big wave of focus on open data. The goal in developing and implementing an open data policy was really to get the best value added for the funding that the Belmont Forum was putting towards environmental change research. And that open data was to really enforce through the full data lifecycle, from not only starting at the beginning when you are getting funding and you're conceptualizing what your research will be and what you're answering, how the data is collected and processed, analyzed, ultimately published, and that's where the focus is today with our data accessibility statement, and then leading to the ultimate, hopefully, finding and reuse of the data through an archival system. In order to implement the open data policy and principles, Belmont Forum then funded our project, and I'll call it what we call it, which is the e-I&DM project, and that involves several deliverables. What I consider to be a pretty good holistic approach to developing and implementing the policy from many angles, including here the Coordination and Collaboration Office, which I work in, to ensure that we coordinated with all the activities that were going out there, the groups and institutions that were pushing for FAIR data. We wanted to make sure that what we were delivering reflected best practices and state-of-the-art whenever possible. One of our major deliverables was a data management plan template, which we called the Data and Digital Outputs Management Plan, and that is a template for our funders to use in their call process as they request proposals for funded projects along different domain and regional areas. A data accessibility statement is one of our deliverables, but that was not initially identified, since when we first came out, we really weren't sure about that component and how much we could get done. But it became a very good deliverable that we are very proud of. So, and I'll focus a little bit more on that later. We also worked to develop a curricular framework for training because we knew that the human capacity side of doing open data was sorely lacking, and having a curriculum where researchers could understand what was some of the basic knowledge and practices out there that they need to be aware of, as well as a framework for doing our own training in-house for researchers, or at least developing the framework for that. One of our other goals has been an online training toolkit, where we knew that e-I&DM wouldn't be around forever. In fact, we end at the end of summer, but that we wanted to have a toolkit that could be fairly easily modified and updated and findable online. So that was one of our deliverables that we are, again, very happy with. And to test it out through an in-person training module for BF researchers, which we recently did at a kickoff meeting for one of the collaborative research actions that Belmont has funded. The value added part is that basically we wanted to turn the onus of data management into a bonus of shareable data as a deliverable of the published work and the research. It's not just the publication that comes out, but that the data underlying it are more robust, we hope, and findable, of course, so that they can be reused, that the science is reproducible. And we feel that a data accessibility statement and implementation helps to deter fraud as well. We want to ensure that the data can be used in different ways and by other researchers, and making accountability for where those data are and that they can be found helps to do that. And then ultimately, very important in this day and age of fake news, is we want to build trust and validity in the research outcomes. And we feel that those together really provide the value added for Belmont as a funding partnership in terms of what they do and how they do it. The data publishing policy project was led by Fiona Murphy, whom many of you probably know, as well as Bob Samores of our coordination office. He was our coordination officer and worked really well with Fiona to make sure that they were out there pushing constantly and connecting with all the different publishers and stakeholders who were interested in building a data accessibility statement for Belmont's use. They convened an advisory group, held strategic outreach events, and leveraged the efforts of that RDA group that Iain had mentioned earlier to work with many of these publishers, so that we weren't just building it in a vacuum and setting it free, that it was really tied to many of the shared goals between publishers and funders. We hope that our data accessibility statement will have high impact, and we believe it will, because it really is a convergence and alignment of the interests of the funding community, the research communities, not only the funded researchers, but others who hope to get funding and build on existing and knowledge coming out of that research, as well as the publishing industry that wants to communicate and share that information. So it's a great product, a great deliverable to help push open data and open science. As I mentioned, the value added was that we really hope that the data will be reused. From a funding standpoint, I think the information or the data don't necessarily support that funders get that any money necessarily is saved by reusing data. There's sort of pros and cons to that, but that if it can be reused, that's just one more benefit. Key elements of our data accessibility statement were that persistent identifiers could be used and should be used whenever possible for reanalysis, such as DOIs, digital object identifiers, grids, grant IDs, and IDs for physical samples, for example. That the location on the information of the underlying data to the research is accessible, and contact information for who's managing this data. Mapping of the data sets and subsets to the published researchers, so actually which data sets and which derivative data sets were used. Standard terms for repositories and institutions. That's a scary area, right? Because a lot of scientists don't necessarily know about what happens and what should happen to their data once it hits a repository. So our key thing is to get the scientists, the researchers, to think about these things as they are developing their proposals, so that they're not just caught by surprise at the end when their data goes to be archived or curated, archived, and they're all of a sudden having to figure out how to treat their data, how to manage that data at that point. We also want them to think about licensing restrictions to encourage reuse. And Belmont Forum, because it focuses on transdisciplinary data, we recognize that there could be restrictions to access, so that data doesn't necessarily have to be always open. There could be restrictions based on ethics, environmental factors, such as for endangered species, you may not want to disclose a location. Human subjects, of course, are always very critical, and now with the GRDP, we want to make sure that subjects are aware of their rights to not disclose data, and there could be fees. And then the granting agencies themselves may also have considerations or further restrictions. Our DDOMP, lots of acronyms today, basically we want the data to be considered throughout the full life cycle of the research and of the data, so that the considerations start as part of the pre-proposal, proposal, award, and publication efforts. So we want the researchers to think about the long-term value of their data collected, meaning how will it be supporting their research, not just at this publication, but in the future, what that data means in terms of others' reuse. We want them to identify team and personnel responsibilities to show accountability throughout the full life cycle, including at the archival stage. We want them to think about budgeting, that this is going to cost money, and that's where all of these things have implications for how the proposals are written, as well as for funders as to how they evaluate proposals in terms of realistic data management activities. We see the DDOMP as a living document. Oftentimes what you're proposing is several years of research with multiple partners in different countries, and that things change, as you know, when you actually rubber hits the road in research and you find out that things are not as you assume to be. So we see that as a living document and don't ding them for necessarily modifying things as the research goes along. And then we have multiple assessment points in the CRA processors for researchers to give feedback to us and to the Belmont Forum Secretariat as to how things are going, so that we can do mid-course corrections if they need assistance. We want to make sure that the living document doesn't just put all the onus on them to fix things.
Okay, Tina, I'm sorry we're running close to time. How are you doing?
Okay, all right, we'll move forward. Basically, this just shows that the DMP and the DAS work together to increase the visibility, access, and reuse. And other, I sort of spoke about this, so I'll skip through that. Essential step is the repositories, and while I won't have time to go into gory detail, which is good because we didn't actually get to the gory detail, we basically said, please make the effort to store in a trustworthy repository. We gave them some guidelines and some examples of repositories, but that is something that really needs further work. Looking ahead, e-I&DM, while we have a draft statement, and that was the link that was included in the pre-reading, and you can find it on the Belmont e-I&DM website. But basically, there's lots more work to do to connect the goals of data accessibility with actual data management plan, to broaden the network of science publishers that are wanting to apply DOSs or DASs. We want to embed the goals in the development process of the funding proposals. We want more practical guidance to provide to researchers on finding trustworthy repositories and working with them. We want to use science communications and the information that comes out about the research and to promote the data set visibility so that people go and try and find those data sets and reuse them. We want to be able to collect metrics to evaluate how data is being reused. And we want to, of course, look at data accessibility in the context of transdisciplinary data, which often aren't qualitative data in the traditional science sense, but maybe very social science oriented quantitative and qualitative data. And last but not least, just thanking some of the people who are really helpful in developing our DAS, Rowena, Fiona, as I mentioned, Robert Samors, who is our coordination officer, and Dr. Robert Gurney, who was our e-I&DM co-lead at NERC. And finally, here's our grant ID numbers. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Gina. I think what's especially interesting about that project is linking data stewardship right from the grant to the publisher, because by the time, you know, if you're sharing data, only thinking about it, when you get to the publisher, it's too late. And this is an absolutely key part, I think. And so we're running a bit over time. Don't worry about this. We'll have time for Shelley's talk next. And we normally, if all our panelists are able to stay on for an extra few minutes, so any participants who would like to stay on for the questions will run over beyond the hour. Okay, Shelley, tell us how to connect it all together when researchers have no incentive to share data.
Thanks, Katrina. What a great setup. So right as Iain was working on the framework and as Tina and the team at the Belmont Forum were working on all of their deliverables, we were in contact with those two teams, and we were working within the Earth and Space and Environmental Sciences in order to make sure that data was available associated with a publication. And it didn't, for us, we had a coalition of publishers and repositories that came together in order to make this happen worldwide. And we are in the middle of implementation, and so far so good. And I'll tell you about it. Why did we do this? AGU has cared about their data since the mid-1990s. This is our current data position statement that impacts any decision made within our, not only publications, but our society as well. And actually, we're about to do a revision on the position statement to bring it up to speed with the things that are happening with FAIR and everything happening at Belmont and the Research Data Alliance work that Iain has in order to make it current. But the salient point here is within our sciences, the data captured with these, phenomena are a world heritage. That tsunami, that earthquake, the solar eclipse that happened in the United States just last year, it's unique information that has to be preserved and credited to the folks that have actually created that data. So this was our premise. This is why I was hired. This is why we moved forward with the project that we did. And thanks to the Belmont Forum doing a survey for us, they validated that the direction we were heading actually made a lot of sense. And I believe they still have this on their website. The link there is in the bottom left. It's aged a little bit, but I think you can see overwhelmingly that researchers, and this was given to researchers, that they were showing what their challenges were within the digital space. and the first one being really tough to share their data or models. Now, many do, but there is a reluctance. It's difficult. They're not sure what to share, and a variety of reasons. There are other elements within this survey that were also useful, but I'll just keep moving along. So we really were happy to get that validated when we saw the survey results come out. Our project did start also in 2017, so we were tracking really well with everybody else. So we were delighted when the folks that wrote their data principles paper published in Scientific Data, thank you Nature, it has came together, and it really identified that the community worldwide was heading in the same direction. We all wanted to treat our data better, and we, with this concept, it's a fairly simple concept, but it allowed different groups to work towards a common goal separately, but yet together. And we're all getting to the same place in different ways, in different time frames, but we're all moving in the same direction. We asked if we could use the acronym, and yes, we could. And so if you see me at one of our meetings, I've got these stickers, and I'm happy to give them to you. So what is it that FAIR is? Tina mentioned it. You've probably seen it out there in the world. Just very quickly, it does apply to data, but it also applies to any digital object. Findable, meaning you've got a globally resolvable persistent identifier. The metadata makes sense. The documentation about the data makes sense. And it's in a format such that can be found with any search engine. Accessible, meaning you can actually touch it. Now, granted, there's some possibility that some needs to be restricted, but that you can actually get a hold of that data with standard protocols. And it's also important to know that if the data itself had to be purged for some reason, that metadata still exists, so you knew it was there before. There are cases where that's necessary. Interoperable, this one's tough. This one, I think many domains are still working on how to actually do this and what it actually means, but it does mean that communities are able to understand the data created by others. It's in a format that makes sense. There's standard vocabularies, and the level of interoperability, especially within the Belmont Forum work for transdisciplinary work, we're continuing to determine what that means. Some groups have a good handle on it. And reusable means the first three are all working at some level of maturity, and you're adding in clear usage licenses and the provenance and any community standards that are necessary. Of course, there's more detail, so please take a look at the article. And then the implementation can very well be different depending on domain. So we really were benefited from the fact that this was ready at the time we were moving forward with our project. And we focused mostly on the first two, so the FBA and a little bit of the R. So we don't call ourselves FAIR compliant, but we do talk about ourselves being FAIR aligned. So here's our project space, and I encourage you to go here. So COPTUS is the Coalition for Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. Kirsten Leonard from IEDA and Brooks Hansen from AGU were co-PIs on this, bringing together in 2014 a coalition of just about every single publisher within the Earth, Space, and Environmental Sciences. I would say 99% of them, and a good number of the repositories worldwide, and there's over 300 within our space that store the data that we generate in order to come up with some initial guidance on handling data well. But we didn't have the work of the RDA and Force 11 and ESIP just then. Some of that was happening, but it hadn't yet gotten to the point where we could have a full solution all the way through the research process. And right at about 2017, when everyone else was building their guidelines and frameworks, we were getting those products. So this Enabling Fair Data project didn't really build anything new. We adopted what had already happened and been vetted throughout the community. And I'm grateful to those community groups for creating those products, because otherwise this couldn't have happened. And so there's a lot of gratitude, and the value of the Research Data Alliance and the Earth Science Information Partners with Aaron Robinson as their executive director, and the folks at Force 11 has just been enormous for this to happen. Okay, what did we do? So basically it comes down to two basic ideas, but one overarching. So the bottom there where it says we're not putting the data in the supplementary information of the paper. And when I mean we, I mean the publishers of the Earth, Space, and Environmental Sciences that have signed on to the commitment statement, and I'll give you a list of those in a second. So it's a good number of our journals out there. So data repositories are providing the identifiers, they're helping with the metadata, they give landing pages for discoverability. You see all of that there. And again, fair aligned, not fair compliant, because we didn't hit all the letters. And then the publishers have a pretty heavy lift, making sure that the data citations are coded correctly, that they are using the guidance that came from the Belmont Forum's data availability statement in order to make sure it's clear where that data is located, the citations are there, and that they have that, the editors really are a gatekeeper here to make sure that with all of the many situations that are coming in from authors, that they're able to work with them to actually comply with these requirements. And let me keep moving forward. So here's the current publishers as of today, and so many folks on this call have participated. We had a working group that had a large number of publishers, including Nature and Science and Elsevier, Ubiquity and Endowie. Thank you, Endowie. And PLOS was one of our co-leads. Elsevier was a co-lead, but incredible support coming from this team. Some of the publishers came in at the end and were really eager to implement what we had done, and we were delighted to see that. And we have webinars that we're doing with those publishers and their editors to help them understand what it means to actually implement the policy. So moving on, what is it we did? So within the commitment statement, there's different sections on what we're asking different types of stakeholders to do. So publishers have something, repositories have something, funders have something. Yes, if you're a funder on the call, please go look. If you're a society, if you're an institution, but most importantly, let's talk about the researcher. So I'll let you read these words, but I want to highlight for you that what is in blue at the top means the researcher has identified a trusted repository to help them. The researcher can't do those things themselves. They have to find the repository to provide them with the registered persistent identifier, to provide them with support on their metadata, documenting it, to provide them with support in identifying the proper license. This is really important to realize. Many researchers have no idea what a trusted repository is, and we need to help them quickly make those connections. So if you're a repository on the call, think about that. Think about your Hallmark card that you would send out to your researchers and make sure they know that you're the place for their data. So there's an opportunity, Hallmark, in case you're listening. To help out the folks at the Council for Science Editors published for us in their journal, Science Editor, information on the new author guidelines. So these are the text that we put together that each of the journals is implementing. They're putting it into their existing author guidelines, so it won't look identical to the words that we have, but the intention for each of the statements is being implemented by each of the publishers, by each of the journals. So I encourage you to take a look at this, and I'll give you a bit.ly to make it easier, because I realize that blue is a little nasty to try to read, but this will give you some common information. And then the author guidelines themselves talk about depositing the data, how to identify what a trusted repository is, citing and linking, the data availability statement. There it is for Tina. Here we want to make sure that data is unrestricted as possible, but that bottom statement indicates that we realize that some restrictions are necessary. And then we did provide a tool that uses the RE3 data registry of repositories to help identify repositories for you. There are so many repositories, and trying to find one is still difficult. I will be very honest. This tool will help you. It will filter out repositories that take data from researchers. It is in beta. We'd like to hear from you for your recommendations on improving. Okay, here's your bit.ly. This is a one-pager that we've been providing to folks to use. It's and I'm happy to provide the Word documents for you if you want to brand it for your own particular journal. But a lot of the materials that we pulled from ESIP, for instance, the data citation and software citation, ESIP took the work of RDA and Force 11 and added an example specific to the Earth, Space, and Environmental Sciences. So it's a really great guide. And then training video and some other overview. So there you are, grab that bit.ly. And then a wonderful thing happened this week, a product of a lot of effort. We did get published in Nature, thanks Ian, and this was just a couple days ago. And what it does is it kind of gives you all of the materials that we've done so far and is very forward-looking, asking other communities to try to put together some sort of effort to implement and go forward with their own policies and guidelines. So now I wished I'd had the preprint from Ian, because that would have been a perfect citation in here. We almost tracked, I think we did track to the day, which is kind of funny because we definitely didn't share each other's calendars. So take a look at this, and this will give you more information on how to move forward with your own efforts within your own domains. And we're all happy to help anyone who's interested in doing that. So things to do. So assuming that someday you'll get these slides, these links are a little long, but the article for the author guidelines at the top, if you want to be part of the communication happening with our ongoing adoption efforts, we're going to be updating. There's some frequently asked questions on the COPTUS website that we are going to do an editorial review on, because we've learned quite a lot in the last few months, and we want to add all that in. If you want to be a signatory in the commitment statement, there's the link for that. And if you're interested in the challenges that journals have with data citation format for Crossref, that's a thing. If you don't think it's a thing, go to the Scholarly Kitchen article and better understand what it means to get that right. We found that that actually was a challenge for a lot of journals, and if you haven't thought about it, that means you probably didn't realize that you have a challenge too. So that link at the bottom is another useful item, and there's some references to the things we've talked about, and thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Shelley. And I just want to give an extra commendation to Shelley, because she's been giving this lecture at 7 o'clock in the morning. Can you imagine that, having to face the world?
Cheers.
So thank you very much. So just to sum up, essentially what we've done today is present 3 snapshots of what's going on about data sharing. One, Ian has given the big sort of broad picture, how you might stage implementing a data sharing policy. So go and read his preprint. Tina has done the link between the funder's data management plan requirement at the grant stage with a data accessibility statement at publishers. If you're a publisher, go to that data accessibility statement. That's where you can find out exactly how to implement it. And what Shelley and the AGU have done is provide a template for trying to get an entire discipline to do this at once, because I think one of the hardest things is not only to get researchers to share, but to provide them with the support and the repositories and the training that because for many researchers, it's actually almost impossible for them to share their data, and especially in some disciplines. I also want to say that this is not about just biomedicine or the earth and space sciences. That data sharing and the benefits of data sharing apply across all disciplines. Even the humanities, I know there's arguments around this in social sciences, when you consider the sort of where the politics and economics are today, that data and those data are absolutely essential to help strive push forward progress. Okay, so officially we've got 2 minutes for questions, but we're going to run over because we've already got some. And I want to start with one which is a very interesting one because in some ways it's where does the burden of responsibility lie in enforcing these policies. This comes from Thomas Faust at Hindawi, who says there seems to be a presumption that authors are willing to share their data if only publishers would either nudge them in the right direction or provide the necessary tools for them to do so. However, we know that isn't necessarily the case. At what point should publishers stop being enablers and start actually enforcing it? And I would say, you know, not just publishers, but where do funders start enforcing rather than encouraging? And what role perhaps even do institutions have in the data stewardship bit? Because that's perhaps the bit that's been missing from this seminar. So if I could perhaps go to each of you. Let's start in reverse order with Shelley.
Oh, thank you, Katrina.
Publishers have?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. With a longer slide deck, I've got a slide that shows the different communities that support science, institutions and funders, repositories, publishers, and everyone has a role here. We targeted two. We targeted publishers and repositories, and as Tina pointed out earlier, that's not the time to start thinking about your data, but it was where we had our influence. So we've been working author by author in order to help them understand what they need to do, and our policies went into force in mid-March. And they're being transitioned. So any new papers coming in have our full policy in place, but every situation has some nuance to it. So we've been working through those, and some of the more general ways that we're handling items are gonna go into our FAQs to help other publishers see that what we're up to. And we do have other publishers as part of the editorial board for the FAQ, so it's not like we'll do this by ourselves. We're going to do it with the larger publisher community before the text actually goes in. But yeah, we need help from institutions that are encouraging data sharing and provide the infrastructure. There's some concern about sustainability for repositories, funding to support the volume of data that is being redirected out of supplements into repositories. So that's an issue. We need help there. And then Tina's point on having the funders actually requiring it and then following up with validating that it actually happened through the data management plan and the work that they're doing. So yes, everyone needs to continue helping.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say for those participants who have to leave us, we're very sorry. We're going to carry on for another 10 minutes. Please remember to fill in the survey afterwards. So Tina, where do you think the balance is between publishers enforcing and rejecting papers that aren't sharing their data and funders enforcing and not giving out grants to researchers who won't share data?
You know, Shelley said it really well. There's plenty enough responsibility and blame, if you will, to go around for where we are now, but where we are also going. And I think Belmont, and I only speak for my familiarity with the Belmont Secretariat, is that they do see their role as holding both stick and carrot to make sure that the policy is there, the tools and resources are there to help comply with those open data requirements, and then hopefully to work with the other groups out there on the publishing to the researchers themselves to make those things happen. I think there's plenty of responsibility from actually researchers too to want to share their data. They just may not be aware of how. So things like, you know, ontologies and standards are really important for making sure that things can be found and that we're all speaking the same language from a science standpoint. So yeah, Shelley did a really good job of really showing that web of approaches that can be woven together to make data more findable and accessible.
Iain. We've still got Iain.
Just unmuting myself. So the question was around whose responsibility, or are we assuming that researchers all want to share their data? And no, I make no assumptions that all researchers want to share their data. Often we're fielding questions, on a very day-to-day level. Researchers are submitting to a journal and they're saying, do I really have to share my data, or is it just encouraging me to do so? And we have to say, where it's the case, well, no, you're just encouraged to do so. But to back that up with a bit of evidence, we've conducted a number of surveys at Springer Nature and often read the surveys of other activities. And lots of researchers do think that finding data is important, and lots of researchers, more than half, are sharing data, but how they do it is often not publicly. It's suboptimal ways like emailing it to one another or using USB sticks, and maybe only a third of researchers are regularly using data repositories. So I think we certainly have a role to promote what good practice is, as well as making good practice easier to achieve, like recommended repository lists or better integrations between systems, etc., etc. But in terms of how one implements a policy, I often describe it as a shared responsibility. So when we're talking to journal editors about going from a more basic policy that doesn't have any real action required, then we identify when we can make that work together. So to be more specific, if there is a particular journal that has a type of data that really should go into a public repository, those responsibilities around checking, well, what kind of science is this? Is it the right data to go into that repository? That's more of a specialist activity where we would look for collaboration with the academics or staff on the journal to ensure those aspects are in place. However, as a publisher, we can provide support for some kinds of standard procedures, like, for example, checking that each paper has a data availability statement. That is a kind of process a publisher can, in principle, support if it's combined with that kind of more discipline-specific expertise to check that the contents of those statements are correct. So there are ways of achieving it in partnership, but it has to be, where there is at least some desire to improve data sharing in that particular journal or community.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very much a phased approach that takes in the cultural norms. I mean, what we haven't talked, and it will be a subject of an OASPA webinar, one of our open scholarship webinars, is about the incentive system, the reward system, and sharing data. But in a related question from Armin Gunther, can data policies contribute anything to ensure or at least improve the reusableness, understandability of data? I think that many repositories, even trustworthy ones, require just some basic general metadata, but do not guarantee that data are understandable and reusable. So all the panelists have talked about putting researchers depositing in repositories and how to find them. How do you know it's a good one? And how do you police that? And how does that work? Okay, Shelley, go for it.
That's a great question, because it's repositories have different services that they provide. Some guidance, and actually we had to update our FAQ guidance, and we have some new text ready to go in on how to think through choosing a repository, at least from our point of view. We do love domain repositories. This is where you get most of your curation support and the data that's similar, and think IRIS for seismological data, think EarthCam.
Shelley, sorry, what do you mean by domain specific? Just please.
So domain specific, so seismology, for instance. Seismic activity doesn't just impact one geographical area. We know that it impacts, depending on its strength, different parts of our world. And so when you bring that data together, you can actually have a better understanding, and your research can actually see impacts based on the instrumentation captured worldwide. And if we didn't all put our data into a single repository, it would be really hard to find it and then make it interoperable. And IRIS does that as part of their normal community support, and the community knows that. So if you are part of that community, then that's where your data should go, and that helps support other researchers in other countries.
But, I mean, most disciplines don't have domain-specific repositories.
Well, then our next option is institutional repositories, but there's a variety of services provided there. Some institutional repositories are very good about curation of data, provide persistent identifiers. Some are so broad that it dilutes the effectiveness when you put a data set in. So encouraging institutions to provide the support that's necessary. There's a project called the Data Curation Network that has across institutions to help with that curation support, and they're working towards that. So that's another possibility. Another having to do with, think large models, high performance computing. That's another challenge. Data of terabyte and more, well, petabyte, let's say petabyte and more, it's really problematic to hang on to different runs of models. And we think about that data a little bit differently because it's, the storage challenges are much more significant. And a lot of that context is in our FAQs for how we think about that. And then lastly, but still very important, is our general repositories. Zenodo and Dataverse, BigShare, Dryad. Dryad's doing a lot of work on trying to partner with institutions and provide support, but the level of curation is much less, as you were mentioning. And so we're trying to think through what does it mean to actually have well-documented data when the only option you have is a general repository.
Iain or Tina, do you want to chip in?
Yes, I would just add, in addition to what Shelley said, is that, you know, one of the things that Belmont is trying to push for too is that, and repositories also have this, is that contact information. So you may be interested in a data set based on its location and some of the metadata that seem to match your needs. But there's something like human communication to say, tell me about this. If you have any questions, to be able to pinpoint a contact and be able to dig deeper, that to me increases the value of that data being understandable or potentially reusable. So I would just add that little bit.
Iain?
To augment a little bit what already has been said, discipline or domain-specific repositories are generally more able to promote, to enable data to be not just findable, but accessible and interoperable as well. So where they exist, they are usually the best option. But it also, in addition to that, any repository, be it institution repository or general repository like BigShare or Dryad, you know, they're better at enabling data to be findable and accessible than other methods of sharing. And I think as I spoke briefly about, there is some evidence that data policies, if implemented in the right way, can genuinely increase levels of data set deposition in repositories. While that might not always achieve all the elements of fair data, you know, we can't get to interoperable and reusable without findable and accessible. So again, sort of breaking the problem down in phases is a good approach.
Yeah. And there's also standards that you can go to, like Core Seal, and other ones you can check what the standards are, and the tool that Shelley talked about, the repository finder, actually tells you what standards apply at that particular repository. Sort of personally, I sort of feel the general repositories like Dryad and Zenodo are really building up a place where any data can be put to a very high standard. Dryad, for example, curates its data, and they're applying the right metadata. And if you're concerned, go to a domain-specific one, and then go to a very, very well-known general repository, because you can always mirror that in your own institutional repository if you want. But the general repository, if you know, like Dryad and others, they have that standard, then you know that the data will be looked after and maintained. We're going towards the end. Now, I appreciate that in some ways this is a very, very complicated topic, and the more you look at it, the more complicated it gets. It could take 2 or 3 day workshops, you know, for different disciplines, and different disciplines are in different places. And often publishers are publishing across multiple disciplines, and so enforcing in one discipline and not enforcing in another means different workflows in different journals, and all of those things. It's a really complicated situation, and on top of that, we have deep inertia among most researchers who don't want to share their data. So this is very, very much work in progress. But I do think the one thing that we can do is to try and align the practices and processes across the different stakeholders and across the different disciplines. And even if, you know, you're getting on to that first baby step of sharing the data, if you can use a process that, for example, that Iain has, where you can phase it in very, very gradually and use some of the language, the same language that other publishers and other stakeholders are using, we're more likely to be able to reinforce that message to all the actors in scholarly communication, whether researchers, funders, institutions, or publishers, and make it easier for researchers to actually do this. It's one of the things I think we forget is, you know, sometimes researchers are blamed for not wanting to share their data, but actually it's almost impossible. So how can we all work together, and regardless of whether you're open access or a subscription journal, this is one area I think where we are all very much aligned. So I would just like to say, would anyone, would the panelists like to just have one last comment, if you'd like to chip in? No, it's just 8:15 and Shelley needs a coffee. Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and look out for the next one, which is going to be really fascinating as well, especially if you're a learning or scholarly society. But that's under wraps at the moment, and we will have one on metadata. That might not sound very exciting, but that's probably in the autumn term, the fall term. But thank you again, everyone, for coming, and thank you especially to all the panelists for contributing your time, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay.